17 forced missed tackles this past season in just 7 games, as well as over 800 yards receiving before a foot injury knocked him out for the remainder of the season. Jalen Royals is one of my favorite receivers that I've watched so far for this year's draft, so let's get right into it. So yes, we're back with another breakdown video, and today we're here to talk about a receiver, Jalen Royals. I'm going to try to pump these videos out, so we're going to be all over the place with these next couple of draft profile videos, but I really want to start with a player that I like a lot, and that is Jalen Royals from Utah State that transferred out from Georgia Military College, that started with Georgia Military College because apparently his grades were not fantastic. He had essentially no recruitment coming out of high school, so he started his career there, didn't have much production, but it was a camp with Utah State where unofficially ran a 4.32, led to him signing with Utah State, and over the past 2 seasons, he's been incredibly productive, over 1,800 yards receiving, because 2 years ago he had over 1,000 yards, then as mentioned, over 800 yards this past season, just in 7 games played. Now, of course, competition is going to be the big question when you look at a guy like Jalen Royals playing at Utah State, but my first glimpse of him was, of course, at the Senior Bowl, and while I don't know that he had a day that it was like, this is his day, he's cooking, it was the ability to open up the route tree, find success, show diversity in the ways that he could win that stood out to me with Jalen Royals. You got to see that on display against some great competition at the Senior Bowl, and I think that that first impression has stuck with me, because then when going back to watch him, while I still have some concerns, and overall I do wonder what's the area that he's going to be great in the NFL. I think there's question marks about that. How is he going to separate against different types of man coverage, specifically against off-man coverage? How is that going to work? And how diverse can his route tree actually be for success when you look at his play speed, which to me is as of now good, but it's not elite. A team that's looking for a receiver to just kind of fit into the mix, that's a willing blocker, that seems to have some really good football intelligence, has some savvy and nuance to his route running, he could be an interesting option. 6 foot, 205 pounds. He's a little bit of an older receiver coming out this year at 22 years old. Jalen Royals to me brings a lot together, and especially that stout frame, which translates really well for getting off the line of scrimmage, and also what he can do once the ball gets in his hands. So let's dive into that first, and let's talk about him as a pass catcher. I want to start out with his ability to get off the line of scrimmage, because for me, I think he has a good release package, diversity to it. His footwork is what tends to stand out when getting off the ball specifically. And again, some of that stoutness to his game, which can allow him to work through contact pretty well. And he shows some burst to get upfield and be pretty effective once he gets an early step on the defender. The speed releases very quickly into strides. He quickly works into his strides, and his strides are a little bit lower to the ground, which I like as well, which allows him to maintain kind of that contact build. He works through that contact. He has a powerful sink when he's working kind of underneath, which can allow him to kind of work through half-man opportunities, not get knocked off his route. Now, I would like to see utilize his hands maybe a little bit more here and find a way, if he had a little bit more shake consistently or foot quickness in a short area, which is a little bit limited right now, so that leads to some limitations against press, just to not allow defenders to kind of hang on top of him. That happens a little bit, especially when he's working some true underneath hitch routes or underneath sit-down routes, that he just gets players off of him. But he's got some twitch when it comes to getting off the ball. We talked about the speed that he works through half-man opportunities. He also carries, I think, good agility when he's working against the press to find a way to create some space. There is a little bit of lateral movement skills there that is pretty low. Me, I think his angles are very fluid as a route runner. This will transition into kind of the stem of his routes. He has an ability to work more close quarters routes, so skinny post, for example, or working a little bit more in traffic, or working a little bit more in red zone situations, because of the angles that he takes. And it sets up from the way that he sells the top of the route with some of the discipline that he showcases, but then also some of the fluidity through those breaks. There's not a lot of false movement as a route runner, specifically at the top of the route, which I think leads to a lot of success, because you don't see the consistent ability to show the burst to really maybe keep guys on his back hip and really separate as he's working in breakers, say against off-man coverage, where he's going to continue to create separation as the play rolls along. However, what you do see is there's a fluidity about his game. There's not a lot of false movement, so it allows him to not get jumped very often in some of those off-coverage assignments. Consistently can get his cornerback flipped into half-turn spots, and I think that's because of the pace that he can run with. He has a disciplined pace as a route runner in that vertical stem, especially against man coverage, where he can change it, he can speed it up, slow it down, but it stays low. It doesn't give a lot of obvious tells to when he's going to set his break, and there's a real realism to the vertical push that he puts on display, where there's a respect that defenders have had to give him, and that opens up half-man opportunities, which he then transitions that really well into the break point and being able to create separation, kind of get guys flipped around, and then being able to work that into a second break. And that's where the fluidity really shows up. Some of the route savvy really shows up to kind of tie things together as a route runner specifically. But you talk about getting off the ball, saw, there's a variety of footwork methods. He's kind of got the 3-step that allows him to open up the slants. He's a little bit less dynamic, which is the big issue here, is that first step, if it's a single step, whatever that release may be, it doesn't have the kind of explosion as dynamic where you're going to get a defender to completely clear out, or you're going to get a guy to completely declare his hips or overset constantly to open up that kind of separation, which again can lead to guys, especially longer press cornerbacks, being able to hold on to him a little bit longer. You didn't see him work on the ball as much when you saw him in stack releases. He was usually the underman that would work underneath the stack, which I liked it because he paced it really well and there was some discipline there, but he wasn't the guy working on the ball as often, which is a little bit of the knockback there. The speed outs don't give a tell, even though it's not maybe the best play speed. And I do think there's examples where his play speed may have to speed up, especially at the next level. Things are going to have to happen faster in general. There's also the aspect if there's a blitz coming, if he has to become the hot read, speeding up the process. But ultimately right now what he does is he maintains a consistent approach to the way that he runs his routes. So there's not a great tell for his speed out routes. It's a very patient setup. I think that you would like to see him be able to work through some of his routes a little bit quicker, just in general. Single steps do a really nice job to get him into the stem with a good burst. He has that ability to pry open inside leverage. We saw that consistently against USC. A subtle hesitation release that he can get to, which I think is very effective because it allows him to kind of work underneath pads and then get upfield and kind of work through contact a little bit better. He just doesn't cover a ton of ground laterally, which is also the big knock here. And it's the little things. It's like this route here that I saw against Temple where he's running this drag route, but it's a man coverage. And the way that he kind of presses his route up a little bit vertically, I would like to see a little more, but press it up a little bit vertically towards the linebacker, which is going to open up his back, but then it can also get his cornerback into a spot where he's now having to work through traffic to be able to stick with the route. There's just a little bit of savvy, even though it's at the same very controlled pace, and you'll see that within his vertical push, which again flips corners constantly. We saw that against Temple. He does have some savvy that gets connected to it as well. Now, as just a route runner in general, he shows some craftiness to kind of work through an inside leverage corner at the top of the route. The footwork that he sets up, I think he's got some looseness within the hips as well. I would like to see a little more ankle strength and ankle bend. That way his cuts were just a little bit more crisp. They can feel a little bit rounded, not as sudden, because I don't think it has that kind of snapping explosion to it. You'll even see this when he kind of settles himself down at the top of the route when he has to snap down his brakes. They don't snap as much as they're just kind of more smooth within the footwork, which leads to just a little bit less natural separation, which really forces him to work back to the football. That's where you'll see like he can break a little bit wide when kind of sticking those routes and then planting it back inside. There can be a little bit of like a outside drift to it. It's nothing that's overly noticeable, but it's just not as crisp. And I don't know how well he'll be able to actually tap into that at the next level, because I think what he does right now really well is that he maximizes it by the way that he paces himself, and he's so controlled, and the body control gets to flash as he's working through his breaks. But the looseness in his hips do show up. He can kind of step over routes. I would again like to see a little bit more hand usage. I think he needs to unwrap underneath zone coverage a little bit quicker, like cover two squatting defenders, unwrap it a little bit faster. That could come back to some of the agility, some of the suddenness. Unwrap that way he's not getting squeezed on the sideline. But that's where you also see the body control. You'll see the route physicality as well, the contact balance, the ability to kind of just tiptoe the sideline, work through contact when tracking the football in the air, but even just kind of maintaining staying in bounds just through his routes, contact, to be able to maintain speed really well through breaks. Biggest knock that I have with his discipline is I felt that it could go a little bit out of the window when he was working zone coverage, where he felt that his eye discipline didn't always feel like it had the best vertical presence to it, where sometimes it felt like he'd flip himself a little bit back to the quarterback too soon. I liked the pace about it. I was fine with that because he understood very quickly man or zone, and you would see him adjust the tempo of his routes to that. His tempo always felt had really good timing, but ultimately I think he could improve some of the discipline working against zone coverage. But again, I love the pace that he works with. You saw that in the stacks that he got to work with, which condensed splits will help. You see him at Utah State. He's working a lot of these wide splits outside the numbers. Kind of gave me vibes of Sky Moore a little bit. Sky Moore used to do that a ton at Western Michigan. I wouldn't say that worked out in the NFL, but I got some vibes. It's kind of like my early comp with Sky Moore is kind of who I felt like I was watching a little bit, just by the way that he aligned, the way that he won. But ultimately, I think the fluidity is what kind of took over. And the build that he has carries a lot of this together for him. Sure, was a little bit more stop-start explosion to his game. I wish the top of the route strength was a little bit more explosive. Then you get to kind of the catch point, and this is where the tracking starts to show up. I think he has good tracking ability, very good tracking ability. And then you'll see, again, some of the savviness. At the top of the route, you'll see a subtle little push-off where he can get himself free. He creates a little bit of extra distance as soon as the ball gets in the air, as soon as it's at the catch point. He can show late reactive hands because his hands are very reactive. He has a background of playing basketball. He's also an all-state high jumper going back to high school as well. So he has that kind of background, and there's just a little bit of savvy, it feels like, when the ball gets in the air, with also that contact contact balance to continue to work through contact and also maintain his speed vertically. And it shows up, those things tie together really well, where he's kind of high pointing balls. That's where you get to kind of the true pass catching aspect. And this is an element that I think, statistically, he was great this last year. He was above average in terms of as the catch rate. His drop rate was much lower this past season. That seemed to improve. His hands don't feel as soft, which is a little bit of an issue. And there are some little knocks that I have, but ultimately, I think he's got slightly above average hands. Shows up, number one, he has a really good burst in his transition, which can allow him to kind of tightrope the sideline. You'll see him work a lot of tunnel screens. Really good burst transition. This is where I got some flashes, just a little bit, not to the same extent, but a little bit of a lesser level of a guy like Romeo Dobbs of Nevada. I got some slight kind of vibes of watching him a little bit, working some of those routes also at a smaller school. The high point timing back to the ball is very noticeable. You get back to the tracking, the way that he would high point, the way that he showed a pretty good catch radius. He doesn't have the best length, but he also showed okay, he maximizes his lengths pretty well. He can work back to the ball, work comeback routes. He times it pretty well. He's got very fast reactive hands. The ball can get on him in a hurry. He can be super reactive. Sometimes I think he's too late, but he does have fast reactive hands that he seems to be pretty confident in. They feel a little bit more natural. He feels like a basketball player in that sense, kind of just attacking the football. And as soon as the ball gets in his hands, he's got shake. He's got a stout lower body. He's got some shake. There's also a second gear that he can really tap into, and you feel the momentum change as soon as he hits that second gear on level 3 routes, or you'll feel it as soon as the ball gets in his hands. Do like that he fights back to the ball when the ball is underthrown. I also didn't feel like there was any kind of I'm not getting to football. You didn't feel any of that. You just felt like he was the same guy all the time. Whenever you threw it to him, he felt like the same guy all the time, which I really love because it wasn't the best passing offense. They had Iowa's transfer quarterback over there throwing to him. But ultimately, I thought that, he was very much the same player all the time, which was great. A couple of issues with hands. I thought that he just left the ground too often. I don't love that. When you're constantly leaving the ground, it's not necessary. That could lead him into some problems as well, working back to the ball, just not trusting the run through with his hands. His hands can also be a little bit too wide, especially in the overhand technique. He's a really nice hands catcher, catches everything with his hands, keeps the ball off his body. Hand size, the problem is to me, he comes in a little bit too wide at times for that, which can lead to the ball getting and slipping through a little bit too much because his mitts aren't massive. I think there's a focus to his technique. I think the hand size is fine, which allows him to not be perfect, but ultimately he can come in a little bit too wide. You even see some underhand pass catching technique, which doesn't feel maybe as fluid, but ultimately does have that, and he'll keep the two hands and he can kind of flip them over, and it's pretty natural. It's very fast, very reactive. Ultimately, the tuck process to finish the process to me gets a little bit loose. He can also misjudge at times when the ball kind of gets thrown off its track. We saw that on tip passes a little bit as well, kind of reacting to it, setting himself up to be the most successful in those spots. But his feet are quick to find the sidelines. His body control shows off towards the sidelines. He's a hand catcher. He shows range as a pass catcher. And as soon as the ball gets in his hands, he's very good after the catch. That stout frame works well through contact. He's willing to work for blocks downfield. It's a player that the big question is beating off man coverage. It's constantly finding ways to beat man coverage. Against longer press corners, can he clear himself up a little bit earlier? I don't doubt that he'll be able to separate against zone coverage. The play speed, I don't think shows to be fantastic. I think it's slightly above average to good right now, but he's faster than that. It just has to come to getting to the next gear. But I love the way that he plays at his pace. He plays at his tempo, and that's consistent. You feel the same pace. He doesn't feel rushed very often, and it doesn't feel like some of these other guys with wide splits that can really struggle to kind of get guys, to pry open their leverage or not jump their routes when they're in breakers all the time. And there was a little bit more variety within his route tree than some of these other route runners. For me, I think he's slightly above average in hands. I think he's slightly above average in separation, which is the biggest knock that I have right now. But he's very good with the ball in his hand. I think he's got a good release package. He's a good route runner. Very good route savviness that also taps into that as well. Very good in contested catch situations, which numbers will back up this last season as well. I wish he was maybe just more of a natural playmaker in terms of catching the football and getting the ball, but ultimately once the ball gets in his hands, he's a little bit of a problem to deal with. So for me, I think this is a player with his body control, with his tracking ability. He lands at a 6.32 for me. I think Jalen Royals is absolutely going to be a day 2 pick, and I think he could get potentially as early as round 2. I'd be a little bit surprised because of some of the man coverage upside, but ultimately I think at worst his floor feels like a round 3 pick. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, though. Thank you, Prop, for watching, and I'm out.